So welcome everybody. Our presentation today is going to be about flooding. So we've titled it Living with Water, using qualitative and quantitative data on flooding to engage with communities and agencies. And so we've got reps from the city, from NYU, and from CUNY. I'll do a brief introduction right now, everybody. So I'm Paul Rothman. I'm the director of the Smart Cities and IoT Lab within the Mayor's Office of the CTO. Also joining us from the city, we've got Rebecca Fischman, who's policy advisor in the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency. We've got Brett Branco, who's the director of the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay with Brooklyn College. Ricardo Toledo-Crow, who's the director of the Next Generation Environmental Sensor Lab, ASRC CUNY. Andrea Silverman, assistant professor at NYU Tandon School of Engineering, and Charlie Mydlarz, who's a research assistant professor at NYU Tandon School of Engineering. Two other folks from our team who are not joining us today, but we want to mention: Elizabeth Henaff, who's assistant professor at NYU Tandon, and Tiga Brain, who's the industry assistant professor at Tandon as well at NYU. So I'm going to hand things off to Rebecca to start on the introduction on urban flooding.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. I'm Rebecca Fischman. I work for the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency. We are an office that is trying to protect and prepare New York City communities for different climate change impacts. That includes flooding, sea level rise, storms, and heat. We do have a variety of programming and policy making, and we are also involved in several different industry and academic consortiums to prepare New York City for future climate events. What I do see is I help manage a few coastal protection projects throughout the city. And when I was going out to communities a couple years ago talking about future storms like Hurricane Sandy, one thing that I heard a lot of was that communities were experiencing just regular flooding, just nuisance flooding every month from high tides, from rain, and from small storms. We hadn't really been tracking this at all. So got to speaking with Paul at the Chief Technology Office and with NYU and CUNY to start this program and to start tracking urban flooding. So how does flooding impact communities? So there can be a lot of infrastructure damage. We're talking about streets, both arterial and local, and sewers and outfalls and all parts of our water system, delivery system. We're talking about contaminated floodwater. So a lot of these areas that flood, like areas close to the Gowanus Canal and Jamaica Bay, might bring in some of the contaminated water into communities. And it also really impacts mobility. So the ability of folks to get around the city, get to their jobs, get to school. If high tide is happening in the morning or at night or during the holidays, there are pretty big impacts to people's social life and to their economic life as well. And you can see pictures here from all different kinds of storms, and these three are specifically from Hurricane Sandy, the big one, and then just regular rainstorm events, something that we call cloudburst flooding in the top two photos. One is of a flooded MTA station. So how can we monitor this urban street level flooding and provide data to stakeholders? So these stakeholders being city agencies, being research institutions who are trying to model future storm events and sea level rise and stormwater, and also communities who are our most important stakeholders. So how is flooding impacting New York City neighborhoods? It's coming two ways. It's coming down from the street, coming up through the sewers due to sea level rise, and it is also coming from rain events and storm events and ponding in the street. Here we can see 311 service requests related to floods, and it really floods throughout the city. This data is really helpful for the city to kind of pinpoint investments and to understand where there's a real concentration of flooding, but it does not distinguish between like regular nuisance flooding and flash floods and rainstorms and hurricanes. So these sensors that we are setting up really helps us to delineate the types of flooding, the frequency of flooding, the extent of the flooding. It really just drills down into the nitty gritty so that we can better plan for the future in all ways.
Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Brett Branco, the director of the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay. I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes about some of the rich qualitative data sets that we've begun to capture around these issues of flooding. And a good place to start is before our work, there was already a very rich qualitative data set on flooding on places like Facebook, where groups from, for example, Howard Beach and Hamilton Beach, communities along the North Shore of Jamaica Bay, were sharing photos of flooding in their communities, and also documenting for each other the impacts that flooding was having, whether it was difficulty getting a child to school because their street was flooded, impact on sanitation services, et cetera, just lots of different impacts. And this qualitative data was hard. It's hard to capture, and this knowledge network wasn't really being shared beyond these communities. And so we started a program called the Community Floodwatch Project in collaboration with New York Sea Grant to tap into that pre-existing effort by communities to sort of document this flooding. But we wanted to capture it in a more systematic way and think of ways to sort of daylight it, as it were, and harness its power. So at its heart, the Community Floodwatch Project is a citizen science project in that where residents are participating in the documentation of this flooding. And the way that Floodwatch works is we monitor lots of different services like the National Weather Service or the Stevens Flood Advisory System to alert communities to the potential of flooding, whether it be from storms or just from, in some cases, nuisance flooding that might result from a full moon or a new moon, and northerly winds or something like that. And so we put out these alerts, and then we ask residents to sort of share those photos and metadata about the flooding that they observe. And you can see in this panel, we're just showing some examples of some of the locations around Jamaica Bay where we've received reports through this Community Floodwatch Project. And again, we're collecting metadata around those photos, which is sort of just like one step beyond what they were already doing in places like Floodwatch. And can you advance one, Paul? And the way that we are collecting this information, we're trying to encourage residents to use a Survey 123 tool so that we can sort of automatically sort of capture that data in a database and get it plotted. But we also, some residents share that information with us via email, in which case we try to extract it and enter it into the database. And sometimes we scrape this information off of Facebook ourselves if there's obvious locations to go look at for it. And right now through our website, srijb.org/floodwatch, the URL is on the previous page. You can access this flood map viewer and sort of see examples of some of these qualitative data that residents are sharing with us. And in this one example of a place out in the Rockaways, you can clearly see the sort of sunny day, high tide flooding that's completely sort of overwhelmed this one particular street, which the residents experience many times, up to 2 times a month, just because of the tidal flooding. So this was taking qualitative data that communities were sharing on Facebook, and then trying to take it one step further and capturing it in ways that we could turn it into sort of useful engagement tools for the community.
Cool. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Silverman. I'm a professor at NYU. And as Brett and Rebecca mentioned, hyperlocal street level flooding is quite pervasive and occurs commonly around New York. And there is an incredibly rich data set that does exist that includes community reports, and it's this qualitative data, either through Floodwatch, the 311 flood requests or service requests, or social media. But there are some challenges with these data in that there's it's not completely systematic, and there is a little bit of bias. And so 311 bias has been relatively well documented in that you need to have a concerned citizen who's actually going to make a report if there's flooding. Similarly with Flood Watch, you also need someone who actually observe a flood event. If there's no one in the location to observe a flood event, then it won't actually be recorded into any of these systems. We also have heard concerns about potential reporting fatigue. So if there's a location that floods pretty regularly and someone every time tries to report it, after a while, if nothing changes, there may be a reduction in that reporting. And so we've been spending a bunch of time talking to a range of stakeholders that include researchers, community groups, community members, and different city agencies around New York City. And what we've heard from a number of them is a desire for more systematically collected and quantitative data on this hyper-local street-level flooding, including things like depth and flood extent, flood duration, things that data we may not be getting from a lot of these community reports. There's been a range of data needs that have been suggested to us, including advocacy by community groups, data for day-to-day decision-making surrounding living with water. For example, what streets might be more dangerous to park your car on certain times of the month. Resiliency and transportation planning for both individuals and city agencies. There is an interest in validating some of these anecdotal evidence of flood extent from our community reports. And in addition to validating flood predictions from hydrological models, and the city is building hydrological models to better predict streets that are more prone to flooding with certain amounts of rainfall, and previously hadn't had data available to actually validate whether those models are making accurate predictions. We've talked to the emergency Office of Emergency Management, and they're interested in being able to have more local emergency response. So flood information in one neighborhood won't tell you something about another. And so being able to respond more locally. And sort of on top of all that, there is anecdotal evidence of changes, increase in flooding in certain locations. And so having a more systematic and quantitative data set will allow us to actually monitor if there are changes in flood patterns and extents in the future. So with all these needs, we've joined together to form the FloodNet Consortium. And so the goals of this consortium are to build and deploy water level sensors to monitor in a systematic and quantitative way hyperlocal flooding around the city. And there's two subtasks. The first, which we'll describe both, but it's to design, build, and deploy low-cost, robust water level sensors. And the second is to actually develop an interface to be able to contextualize and communicate that data back to a range of stakeholders that does include community groups and city agencies for actual use of that data. There's a number of us involved, as mentioned, researchers at NYU and CUNY, colleagues at the Science Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, and the mayor's offices of the chief technology officer and mayor's office of resiliency. We've been meeting on a weekly basis and working together to build up this program. And we have partnerships with the community groups in the communities that we've been working in so far. So our pilot communities are in Hamilton Beach and in the Gowanus neighborhood of Brooklyn.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ricardo, Toledo-Crow, and I'm going to speak with you about the technology that we're using. And this is going to be a bit of a ping pong because we have two deployments, one in Gowanus, one in Hamilton Beach. So I'll be back and forth with Charlie, who has been doing the Gowanus installations. But we both use pretty much the same basic technology. It's low cost, off-the-shelf components. And to be perfectly fair, there's a number of groups throughout the world, actually, that have been using this pretty much the same technology. It's all based on microcontrollers, solar panel powered, so that it can be independent of any hookup to the grid. We put the sensors into weatherized housings, and the main measuring device is an ultrasonic range sensor that just measures the distance from the unit to the ground, and when there's water, it measures the difference. Charlie, do you want to talk about the next part?
Thank you. Yes, I'm Charlie Mydlarz. I'm a research assistant professor at NYU and just be mainly focusing on the hardware aspects of the sensor and the back end. And I wanted to mention that we're really pushing for a very open platform for all of our hardware, software, and all of our analysis scripts. So we push everything up to our public GitHub repo or our GitHub organization. You can go to that at github.com/floodsense. And what you're seeing here is the specific repository that houses everything around the sensor, all of the bill of materials. You could just click through to the next one. The bill of materials there, so links where you can buy everything. All of our hardware is typically off the shelf. There's some custom firmware and a slight bit of custom building to actually get the sensor together. But essentially everything can be purchased and put together from Amazon and other sources. And one more click. And we include things like connection diagrams, build photos and guides, because we really wanted to build an accessible flood sensing platform so we can enable communities to engage with these tools and help us collectively collect more hyperlocal flood data. Okay, next slide. So Ricardo mentioned earlier that we were building sensors that weren't too reliant on existing infrastructure. So that's why we've gone with a network connectivity technology called LoRaWAN. And LoRa essentially stands for Long Range Wide Area Network, LoRaWAN. And this is really important because we know that it's difficult to deploy things in New York City. As soon as you have requirements like if your sensor needs Wi-Fi or it needs continuous power, you're really limiting where you can mount these kind of sensors. And when you're asking for permission to mount these kind of things, you want to be as independent from infrastructure as you can be. So we went with a battery-powered sensor, so we're not reliant on plugging in to anything. And we've gone with this LoRaWAN networking technology, which essentially gives you very wide coverage from a single gateway. And you're seeing there the gateway mounted to a rooftop in Gowanus. And this effectively covers that whole green area with connectivity for our sensors. We've got another gateway down in the Jamaica Bay area. And this really just gives us freedom to deploy anywhere in this area without needing to hook up to power or any kind of networking connectivity at the deployment site. So to give you the idea of the pipeline of our infrastructure, so you've got the flood sensor on the top left there, communicating via LoRaWAN, very small packets of information, probably just its battery health and the actual the flood depth. It hits that gateway, which you saw mounted on the roof, and then it transmits back to this open platform we use called the Things Network, which essentially consolidates all of our readings and measurements into one place, and then we pick up all of those packets, all those depth measurements, the battery levels of the sensors, and it hits our backend servers where we kind of pre-process the data, we store it in an InfluxDB database, and then we visualize it using our backend Grafana kind of dashboarding data visualization platform.
Yeah, so we here at in the Hamilton Beach deployment, we're doing things that's a little bit differently, even though we're converging on hopefully the same platform. But we've been relying on the Google Script and the Google Cloud tools. And the advantage there is that they seem to be very well understood by many people of the community. They understand and can sometimes take on some of these developments on their own. So we have the same thing all the way to the Things Network cloud. And then from there on, we just download to 3 of the Google tools that allow us to store the data in Google Sheets, basically. And then, of course, you can do your graphing, and you can do your further deployments from the Google Sheets. The downside, obviously, is that the Google Sheets do have a size limitation, even though Google will allow you to pretty much make as many sheets as you want. But yeah, each sheet has a certain number of entries, a limited number of entries. But as I say, it is a quite popular solution, and it works very reliably. So here we're seeing a couple of these sensors. On the left, you have just the box and the solar panel. We have it mounted right over the Hawtree Basin in Hamilton Beach, and that's acting as a tide gauge, just giving us the height of the tide. And on the right is the actual sensor on the street, also in Hamilton Beach, in one of the sites that suffers the most frequent flooding. And yes, that's myself and a student setting it up.
So this is the 2 sensors we currently have up at around the Gowanus area. The sensor on the left is mounted over the canal, similar to the coastal sensor measuring the coastal level. So this was to give us an idea of like how the rise and fall of the Gowanus Canal may correlate and relate to the flooding that occurs on the street from our sensor on the right image there. So that's mounted on a street signpost. We're really lucky to get permission from DOT to mount on those street signposts. And that is a commonly flooding area. And we've seen that it does actually, that there have been times when a flooding on that street does coincide with high water levels from the canals. There's definitely interaction going on there.
Okay, so yeah, back to Hamilton Beach. For those of you who may not know where Hamilton Beach is, that little blue sliver of New York down there on the north end of Jamaica Bay. Next, and this is the neighborhood where we've been deploying. We have flood sensor 1 and 3 are on the road, on the flood-prone parts of the neighborhood. Sensor 2 is over the basin, over the water, and way off on the right-hand side we have the LoRa gateway that we were lucky to be able to mount on the firehouse there. The volunteer fire department gave us, and we to mount the gateways you do need connectivity into the internet. So they provided that for us. Next. And this is the kind of floods that we've been monitoring. The one you see there actually happened last year, but this is very typical. You can see the whole street is flooded, sun's out. Obviously, access to this part of the neighborhood might be restricted, and obviously there's some important damage. Next, and this is a little bit more dramatic. This was back in December when we had a high tide flooding, and you can see the entire street is flooded, and we've been picking up these floods.
So something we also did, this is a couple of weeks ago, I think. So we went out and we deployed more sensors down in the Hamilton Beach area, but we also co-located the different designs of the NYU and CUNY sensors on the same location. You can see the CUNY sensor is the green pipe mounted to the left of the pole, and then the NYU sensor is the kind of louvered white thing actually mounted higher up on the pole. And we've been experimenting with different housings and to try and get the best accuracy from these kind of measurements. And this is ongoing. I mean, these are all prototypes. We're going to eventually settle on a design. But yeah, we're learning a lot from getting these sensors out there and detecting these floods in these locations.
Great. So this is the kind of data that we're getting. On the left, you have the live display that we're receiving from the sensors. This was back in early February. It was the Groundhog Day northeasterner that dumped a ton of snow and ice. And it also coincided with a high tide. You can see there on the bottom graph, that's the sensor from the basin. From Hawtree Basin, you can see that it was indeed an over 8-foot tide from the lower level watermark, and yeah, there was flooding up to 1 foot, just under 1 foot of flooding, and you can see there, right on that utility pole on the side, you can see the sensor. So we picked that one up, and then down below and to the right, you can see how this configuration works. It pretty much uses the pipe as a protection, and it also sort of helps us to fixture it against the utility poles or any other structure that we can find. But otherwise, it's identical to the small ones that Charlie just showed.
So this is the street corner that you saw in a previous image, where we have a sensor on the street signpost. So this is our first great flood of 2020. We were really strangely excited to see our first flood picked up. So it's not that deep. We're talking about 9 centimeters that this flood went up to. But remember, this is the sensors measuring the water level on the sidewalk. So actually, the water level on the street is much deeper. So it's been what's been really interesting is that you can actually see the profile of the flood. It's not just that there's it's not a binary flood or no flood. We've actually got that profile, which is really interesting and has been of great interest to some people doing hydrological modeling of the stormwater sewer systems, because that profile shows you how long the flood takes to dissipate and can give you clues as to what's happening in the sewer system. So it's been really great to see that. And you can see it doesn't really correspond to the canal level, but you can see the canal does bump. At the same time, we noticed that street flood. So it's really interesting.
So I'll jump back in here. And And so, yeah, so with the team developing the hardware, that brought us to thinking about, how that data was going to be conveyed to the public. And so we applied for a grant from New York State. The Empire State Development Corporation put out smart city grants for different cities within New York State. And we applied for one to build out a data dashboard for this project. And so we were fortunate enough to be granted some funding. We're hoping that funding is going to start to come in to us in the second quarter of this year, so maybe in a month or so. And then we'll be able to start working with a partner that we had selected. So along with the grant funding, there was also sort of an open call for people and companies who could provide the dashboard services. So it hasn't been announced yet, so that's why I'll be sort of cagey about it. But hopefully soon that partner will be announced. But we selected a partner to build out this dashboard with us. And so the challenge was to try to make the collected data available for various stakeholders. So that includes the community groups that have been involved in these communications from the start, researchers from the different academic institutions, as well as this different city agencies, not only Mayor's Office of Resiliency, but we're also connected with the Department of Environmental Protection, as well as the Department of Transportation within the city, the Office of Emergency Management. So there's a number of other agencies that are sort of tapped in as advisors or stakeholders from within New York City government. And so the goal that we're looking to do with this dashboard is, we're looking to consult to understand what the different requirements and needs are, and then to design and build and deploy this data dashboard that would satisfy these requirements. So, what are some of the things that we want to get out of a dashboard? Well, we want to be able to display the sensor locations, their current readings, and then sort of long-term temporal flooding events and trends, and some analysis as well. We'd like to be able to, have the platform have some amount of socializing, so kind of bringing some of the components of some of the existing, let's say, like Facebook groups or other community groups where people who are experienced flooding are able to comment and talk to one another, looking to have the data be queryable in a database so you can take it outside of this dashboard and do other types of analysis. And then also the ability to include other data types such as meteorological data or 311 data. So that can be, the qualitative data can also be looked at alongside some of the quantitative data that's going to be coming from the sensors. And then in addition to that, through the stakeholder engagement with these different workshops and things that are going to be held with the community, will surface other additional needs that should be included. So, as an example, and Charlie showed before, looking at some kind of like temporal, view of high tides and things like that, and we need to, understand, the needs of the community. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining. We wanted to leave time open to take questions. We can go a little bit over. I know the session was labeled as like 1 to 1:40. We're happy to extend it, a little bit longer to catch people's questions. And so I guess we can use the raise hand function. We hadn't really talked about this. I'll stop sharing the screen. If people want to use raise hand functions, I think I can probably go through and unmute people, give you the floor. You can ask questions of the team. But before we go to that, we just wanted to make a few acknowledgements. Some of the folks that have sort of helped out with funding. There's C2 Smart. There's the CUNY Office of Research. There's the Marin Institute for Urban Management at NYU, and the New York State Empire State Development Corporation. So with that, I'll stop screen sharing. And then, if folks want to use the raise hand function, I think I should be able to see in the side panel, and then can, take questions. Okay, we've got Jessica Copy.
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 Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Copy. I'm a fairly new fellow working with the innovation part of inclusive innovation, part of Mocto. And I had to leave the room briefly, so you may have mentioned this and I may have missed it, but I'm curious if this is also being done in the Lower East Side, where I know that there have been a lot of concerns about climate change and flooding, and also because of Sandy and rising tide, et cetera. So I'm curious if you're also doing it around there.
I guess I can take that. Thanks for the question. Right now, we're not. We have sort of pilot deployments at this point to just make sure that the sensors are like working long-term in the environment, that we're getting the data in as we need to. And as we start to develop this data portal, and also has to do with funding. And so at this point, we do have the funding to start in Gowanus neighborhood and in the Jamaica Bay neighborhood. And it's interesting because the type of flooding that the two neighborhoods receive is quite different. So the neighborhoods around Jamaica Bay, like Hamilton Beach, are, as mentioned, really susceptible to tidal flooding. And it's like twice a month with high tide is when these neighborhoods are impacted. Gowanus is at a low-lying area where there's a lot of sewers that comes together. And so there's a lot more sort of sewer-based and overland flooding. So we are hoping that we'll be able to expand to other locations. We're just not there yet. But thanks for that suggestion as another neighborhood to look into.
Can I add something to that too? Because a couple of weeks ago, we ran a workshop with some of the communities that are part of the Flood Watch program, which included Hamilton Beach. And so at the end of the workshop, we gave a very brief update on the sensors. And we were kind of a little bit overwhelmed with the response of the participants in that workshop. It seemed like everybody wanted to have sensors. And so we immediately started talking about the need to sort of develop, just some information, some easily digestible information for communities about the sensors, and we can imagine a future where once we have the network built out and the portal and the dashboards, at that point, you can imagine a future where communities might be able to raise funding and purchase a sensor, maybe an off-the-shelf sensor from a vendor, install it and plug into the network, and then all of a sudden, they've got theirs. But that's a little bit off into the future, but I think it's part of the aspirations of this project.
Yeah, and I'd like to jump into, so as Charlie mentioned, the design from the get-go has been to try and keep things as simple and accessible as possible. So, there seems to be a lot of interest to get the communities themselves involved into the making of the technology. So the idea is to have make-a-thons or get high school students involved. And really what I think would be important is to have the communities themselves take ownership and take the management of the hardware, of the sensors on the street, because that's really the difficult part long term, is to just keep these things running and keep them in good shape. So that's something that again is in the future. Doing the technology transfer to the communities, I think, is very important to us.
Do we have any other questions? I don't see any hands raised, so I'll leave it open to see if there's any other questions coming in. Okay, well, if not, we can adjourn. I'll just plug, we have a newly deployed website, which is FloodNet.NYC. That is where the dashboard will be located once we've built it out. So that's going to be, once we get the funding, the grant funding released, hopefully during the summer, we'll have the sort of like beta of that website up. In the meantime, if you go to floodnet.nyc and you go to the contact page, there is a sign up for more information. So if you give us your information, we can follow up and sort of send out a mailing once the website goes live, and other updates that are worth sharing. We're not sending out like a weekly thing or kind of like have a big sort of outreach plan. But once we hit some milestones, we'll have a list of interested parties and we can contact you about it. So with that, thank you all very much. And if you're really interested in flooding, I believe there's another session at 2 p.m. about 311 flooding from a colleague within New York City government. So you can check that out as well. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.